The following is a local resident producer's program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of Oshkosh Media, the City of Oshkosh, or your video service provider.
Got Speaker John Walkman here. He's a retired archaeologist who spent a lot of time working with the Wisconsin Archaeological Rescue Program with the Milwaukee Public Museum. He was one of the people who really started to look at historic era archaeology in the Midwest. Prior to this time, it was something that you'd see more out in the eastern states. So he has had a lot of experience on sites, including the Dubé site in Wisconsin. We'll talk about the connection here, but so we're glad to have him. Just mention that afterwards we have a donation jar over on the table. If you'd like to see more speakers and more events, just consider dropping something in. But we'll wait for about 2-3 minutes and see if anybody shows up. But glad you're here, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. Probably get started.
Get started? Yep. Okay.
That was a short 3 or 4 minutes.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm not big on microphones, so if anyone can't hear me, just let me know, and I'll speak louder. As Adam pointed out, my name is John Walkman. I have not been involved in archaeology for probably longer than most of the few of you have been alive. My archaeological background, I have a degree, a graduate degree, but for most of my career I've worked in the business industry. I've got my undergraduates in accounting, and then I got involved in archaeology. The way I got involved in archaeology is even kind of interesting. In the early 1970s, the EPA Act came out, and most people, when you mention the EPA, Environmental Protection Act, they think of natural resources, but there was a cultural resource component to that, which at the time required any federal, state agency, or even private firm who was involved in a land development that required a federal or state permit and or federal state funding, they had to have an archaeological reconnaissance done to ascertain whether any prehistoric or historic sites were going to be impacted by the effort. Well, a couple of the graduate students, doctoral students at UWM at the time, I was working for an accounting firm at the time, and wanted to put together a consulting firm to help these federal state agencies comply with this new requirement. Everyone was scratching their head, okay, what's an archaeological reconnaissance? What do we have to do? Well, we started a firm called Great Lakes Archaeological Research Center, which was, we call it GLARC. And I came on board because of my business background, also because I had an interest and was degreed in archaeology. Well, like most small firms, when you get started, everybody wears a lot of hats. And so I started taking on some projects to help the cash flow, if you will. Well, prior to the what came to be known as cultural resource management, not a lot of interest was had in historic archaeology. Everything was prehistoric. The time I spent going to school, I can't ever remember a discussion among archaeologists about historic material, with maybe the exception of an individual named Ed Eric Bauer, who was very interested in the fur trade. But other than that, everything was pretty much ignored, and the focus was on prehistoric. Well, by default, I ended up doing the historical part. Nobody wanted it. And so my first excavation was at Fort Des Moines #2 down in Des Moines, the Palmer House in Dubuque, the Jackson House on Highway 50, the Morris D. Cutler Homestead in Waukesha on the library grounds, and a host of other historic projects. And as a result, I developed an interest in it. It kind of, to me, was fascinating, probably because I was more interested in history than I was really in anthropology. Although you have to understand that archaeology in itself is not a discipline. It's only a methodology, it's a technique. It draws its theoretical framework from anthropology, so that's why you have to be an archaeologist as well as an anthropologist, to put two together. So anyway, we would also respond, as Dr. Asigian is aware, you get calls, and a site will be threatened by some sort of development, so you get a call and you sort of have to run out and deal with it. Well, GLARC received such a call regarding a prehistoric site on the Milwaukee River. I don't know if you're familiar with the Milwaukee area, but right off Port Washington Road, there's a dam, and then the Milwaukee River flows through there. There was a large tract of land that was owned by the Schlitz Brewery and was being sold for development of a large apartment complex. Well, it did not really require, under federal or state statutes, any archaeological reconnaissance. However, the developers were sensitive to the culture resource there, so they contacted GLARC and asked us if we could do. They gave us probably about a month worth of time to excavate this. We went out, we found this prehistoric site, or it was found by it was known to be there, and when we tested it, it was very, very extensive, huge site, late woodland site. Well, we didn't know what to do with it, or how we could handle it, and it would have been a very, very costly endeavor for us. So we put an ad in the Milwaukee Journal, and as a result, we got 150 people who responded that were willing to help us out and with the excavation. Well, we did the excavation, and it was a very good one, and a lot of the people that came in turned out to be extremely good field technicians. We were very fortunate with the group, and there was a lot of logistics involved with it. We had so many people, you couldn't have 150 people on the site at the same time, so we had to schedule and program and what have you. Well, when this project was finished, a lot of these individuals that had volunteered said, there's got to be more. Can we do anything else? So one of our colleagues, Dr. Marion Olson, worked at the Milwaukee Public Museum. At that time, the Milwaukee Public Museum was still run by the county, under the stewardship of the county. And she was the head of the education department. And so in discussions with her, she says, if you want to put together an organization, an adult education program, we'll give you space down at the Milwaukee Public Museum for both classroom and lab. And we'll make it part of our education program. So we put out the word that this is what we're going to do, and we started to offer formal classes in archaeological technique. Well, at that time, we were approached by by Dr. Nancy Lurie, who was the head of the, I think it was anthropology, and she asked us if we'd be interested in doing a project for the museum. And they had 33 trays of artifacts from the DeBay site. All right, this is the first time I had heard about the DeBay site, but we decided, okay, we have all these people that are interested. They're willing to do all the lab work, the label, cataloging, cleaning, the whole 9 yards. And we put together this program and came up with the name Archaeological Rescue. In fact, I think I have some sweatshirts and t-shirts that it's actually a little outlined red cross with Archaeological Rescue on it. Well, what resulted was this report. The interesting thing about this project is the backstory, though. This, the material, the 33 museum trays that were at the museum had been there since 1941. Almost 50 years. Had not been touched. The material was in the original bags that they were excavated, put in after excavation. They some were wrapped in 1941 newspapers, and when we started looking at it, say, wow, there's got to be more to this. What's the story behind this? Well, Dr. Lurie said, well, there's Dr. Filio Nash in Wisconsin Rapids was the one that did the excavation. And I said, well, can I get a hold of him? Can I talk to him? Is he still around? She said, oh, yes. So I went up to Wisconsin Rapids and I talked to Dr. Nash and got the story. Now here's the story. Dr. Nash's family had lived in Wisconsin Rapids since the 1860s. His grandfather worked for the railroad. And even as a railroad worker, he also got involved with cranberry harvesting. Now in the 1860s, the cranberry industry was not done with artificial man-made bogs. It was just natural occurring bogs. And he worked with the Indians in probably a small scale. Anyway, their family is the family that developed the artificial bogs that we're familiar with today, and made a big industry out of this. In fact, Dr. Nash had a huge research and development building where they not only developed different types of machinery for harvesting and raking and all this other stuff, but they actually manufactured it there. Well, anyway, Dr. Nash's cousin was a man by the name of George Meade. Now, George Meade, we know from the Meade Paper Company. That's the George. Right. And this Meade Paper Company had evolved into Consolidated Water and Paper. Consolidated Water and Paper were going to put a dam on the Wisconsin River just north of Wausau, near a place called Knowlton. And this would result in a flowage which would be called Lake DeBay. All right. Well, Dr. Nash, when he, in collusion with his cousin, Consolidated Paper says, you know, if you want to go and do a reconnaissance of this area, and this is in 1941, it was in November of 1941, we will give you $500 for the project, and if you need more, we will certainly continue our sponsorship of it. So Dr. Nash took some students, and a man by the name of John Walker got involved. He was with Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., had worked on a lot of WPA projects. They went out and they tested the area, and they found a number of prehistoric sites, but they found a site that was associated with Jean-Baptiste Dubé. Now, for all you people from Portage, I'm sure you're familiar with that name. When Jean-Baptiste Dubé lived here, he lived about 200 feet down there. Anybody know about Jean Dubé? You do, okay. I'll go over the background. Okay, there was a trading post there, and the property was owned by the American Fur Trade originally. Dubé was probably the last factor or supervisor of that trading post. Well, in the 1840s, when Dubé lived there, it probably wasn't a trading post because by that time the fur trade had moved out west. You know, the fur-bearing animals had been pretty much overexploited here, so it was gone. Well, on that during that period, it was very normal for the last person, the last factor or employee of the fur trade company, just to remain on the land and live on it. Now, I'm not aware if there was any legal transfer of land title on that piece of property, but it was assumed that the American fur trade had abandoned it, they didn't need it anymore. Dubé felt it was his property. Well, there was a man from Portage called William Reynolds, and he felt that no, he doesn't own that land. You know, we can utilize that land, or I can do what I want on that land myself. He doesn't own it. It's kind of like public lands. So he started to build a sawmill on this property. Well, when he had started it, Dubé had been off, I believe, I was led to believe, on a hunting expedition. And when Dubé came back, he saw this structure, this sawmill, the framing on his property. And he was quite upset about it. So he tore down the framing. Well, word got back to William Reynolds in Portage that his sawmill enterprise had been destroyed by Dubé, so he gathered some of his cronies in the local tavern and they marched out here. Well, they got out here, and this is where the story gets a little bit muddy. You know, there's both two sides to every story. Anyway, the upshot of it is that apparently Williams had either brought a board or a stick or I think it was something he might have taken off the picket fence there. Anyway, he had this large wood bat or whatever, and he was threatening Dubé with it. Well, Dubé, who was sitting in the kitchen, his kitchen, and he was drinking, imbibing, heard the commotion. He went out around the back of the house with a shotgun, and he confronted Williams, or William Reynolds. Anyway, in the confrontation, he shot Reynolds with the shotgun, killed him. He was arrested, taken to jail in Portage, and the result of, there was a bunch of townspeople wanted to lynch him that night. You know, he was his father was French, and his mother was I think she was an Oneida. So you know, he was what was termed then a half-breed. Okay, not very popular, and so the townspeople, they wanted to lynch him. Well, anyway, he survived that and was brought to trial. Well, he had Dubé had a lot of high political connections. Governor Doty, Moses Strong, they all came to his aid, testified to his good character, whatever, at the trial, and the trial ended up in a hung jury. There was a second trial that was scheduled, same result, hung jury. They scheduled a third trial. The third trial never transpired, but Dubé by that time broke financially and also psychologically. He had, you know, he had been put through a whole lot. So he decided to leave Portage and move up to Knowlton. And this is that the site, his residence site up in Knowlton, in what now is Lake Dubé, was where he lived, and this Dubé collection reflects the material that was excavated from that site. Now, we're pretty well convinced that this, in fact, was a trading post. The question of the Knowlton site, or the Lake DeBay site, we know his father, Louis DeBay, had a trading post up there prior to Jean-Baptiste DeBay moving up there with his family. And it was thought that according to at least Dr. Philio Nash, that this excavation would result in material from a late trading post. And again, when the war started in December, this was all excavated in November, and when the war started, the material was just shipped down to the Milwaukee Public Museum, probably because of Dr. Kern had provided all the field equipment. In any event, the DeBay site, from what our understanding, had burned down up there. Now, in historic archaeology, when you have a site that burns down, that's a good thing, because it preserves a whole lot of material. Anyway, I guess the fire started. They would collect the ashes from the wood stove and put them in a barrel on the porch, and they would use it to make soap, lye soap. And anyway, they had put the ashes in there and went off to do something in town or whatever, and in their absence, the embers flared up and burned down the house. So, when the war started, Dr. Nash, he went out, he got involved in the war effort. I guess his whole family was pretty prominent. From what I understand, Dr. Nash was at one time Lieutenant Governor of the state of Wisconsin, and politically, and he was also a speechwriter for Kennedy and Johnson, and he also served as a Indian commissioner under John F. Kennedy. So the family was very politically connected. At the time Archaeological Rescue took on this project, unfortunately Dr. Nash was suffering from liver cancer. And when I went up, and I visited him quite a few times, because we had everything in the collection. We had the maps and everything, but we had no field notes. And any archaeologist will tell you, without field notes, you're pretty much dead in the water. You're kind of relegated to artifact description, and that's it. Because you need those notes, because you have to have the provenience and a lot of information on that excavation. If you don't have it, like I say, you're going to have problems. So I thought, in the absence of field notes, Dr. Nash would help me out. And he did. He was very courteous. But running in the background was the thing. He was very proud of his effort in doing this excavation. And he really wanted to wrap it up. He wanted closure on this site. And I wanted to see if I could get this all completed in the final report to him before, he succumbed to his disease. We did that. We just got under the wire, but we did that. Anyway, this effort by Dr. Nash was really the first investigation of late historic period sites in the state. When we started to do this analysis, we didn't really have a format to follow. In prehistoric archaeology, everybody's doing it. There's dozens and hundreds of reports at different sites. It's all already nicely defined for you, and it makes it a lot easier. What you find as a prehistoric, you can kind of plug into an already existing theoretical framework. In historic archaeology here, we didn't have that framework. Historic archaeology, if you started in to reference material, you'd always end up dealing with sites on the East Coast, Williamsburg, for example, colonial sites. So we didn't really know how to deal with this body of data, these artifacts. So we decided to pick those categories of artifacts that were the most diagnostic and we could do the most with. And we ended up with, I'm not going to go in and discuss the particulars of it, but we picked ceramics. Ceramics are good both prehistorically and historically because they're non-perishable and they are very, very diagnostic, and they're easily the collections are easily put in a chronological order for dating. We picked clay pipes. Some people call them kaolin clay pipes. Actually, they're just white clay pipes. They're very, very prevalent during the whole early historic period, right up until cigarettes didn't come in until around the Civil War. The problem with clay pipes is they're very fragile, and they're always breaking. And for those, probably nobody here has ever smoked a pipe. I used to smoke a pipe. Pipe smoking is an art. Pipe smoking is a very, very time-consuming endeavor. And when you're in the military, you're on the march and you can stop for 10 or 15 minutes, you're not going to put a pipe together and get a pleasurable smoke out of it. What they would do is they take any sort of paper, to wrap the tobacco in, and that's where cigarettes got started. The other ordnance. When I say ordnance, we're talking about like anything that has to do with weaponry or guns, cartridges. There's a lot of documentation on cartridges. There are whole reference books for you to go through, like buttons. Buttons is another category. When I first got started in historic archaeology, a button was a button. And I really didn't think that they could tell you a lot. Well, I ended up joining the National Button Society, and I would get their newsletter and all that. And you know, no matter what category of artifacts you have, somebody out there collects them as an expert. That's all you have to do is go search. Anyway, flat glass. Flat glass or window glass is another thing you think, well, what can it tell you? It can tell you a whole lot. With historic artifacts, it's the manufacturing technique that is gives it a characteristic. For example, if you see a pane of glass that has circular striations in it, almost concentric, it's going to be crown glass. If you see the glass that has what they call kind of straight striations and what we call whittle marks, kind of imperfections, that's glass. The glass would be blown on a round disc and then kind of twirled and form a cylinder. It was laid on a cast iron bed, and it was cut with shears and flattened out. Well, its contact with that iron bed, if you will, causes imperfections. Then you ended up with what they call plate glass. That's where glass was poured out like you do big fudge, and you're kind of rolled out. Again, that has perfections. Seeds or bubbles. Take for example, bottle glass. If you have little seeds or bubbles in there, you know it's before 1915, period. I mean, that's so diagnostic. Well, why do I say so emphatically 1915? Well, glass up to that point, if you ordered window glass or something, you didn't get the thickness was whatever came. It could be paper thin or it could be very thick. There was no industrial standards for window glass. And in 1927, the government started to order large quantities of glass, and they set standards that glass manufacturers had to adhere to. That's when glass got standardized. No bubbles. It had to be clear. This is another indicator of the chronology. Glass, in its natural form, is kind of aqua green, kind of the Coke bottle. If left to its own devices, nothing is done with it. You take the silica, the sand, and you get it down to the vitrification, is the term they use, of glass, and do it. If you're going to make a bottle out of it, you're going to make a window. If it's that Coke bottle green, that's a natural. That hasn't been touched. Okay, well, nobody really cared if it was that green or whatever. It had to, the color really was a reflection of the oxides. If you had like high iron oxide content, it would be kind of reddish. If you had cuprous oxide in there, it'd be greenish. If you had a lot of carbon in there, it would be amber. If you put cobalt in there, it'd be blue. If you put gold in there, it'd be red. These were oxides that were added. Well, if you wanted to go the other way and wanted no color and wanted perfectly clear glass, you'd add manganese or arsenic to it. Okay, these were what they call decolorizing agents. So anyway, by understanding the manufacturing technique over time, you could deal with these historic artifacts, I think in a pretty sure fashion. And then putting them all together, you can build sort of a composite of what that particular site was used for, the period, and oftentimes very specific tasks, if you will. Wells are another thing. I've had occasion to excavate quite a few wells. And as I was telling the listeners earlier, excavating, when you go below ground, that's dangerous. I don't care what the endeavor is. When you go and your head gets below the surface, you have a potential dangerous situation there. The first well that I excavated was the Morris B. Cutler homestead in Waukesha. We found the well by using a ground-penetrating radar. And so the decision was made, let's excavate it and see what we could find. The problem was we had no reference for it. We didn't know what to expect. I had no idea how wells were dug, built, or whatever. Fortunately, there was a gentleman well in his 90s who was kind of rubbernecking in this excavation, and he was an old well digger. And he started to give me tips and information. Pretty soon he became my mentor, and I learned a whole lot about wells, how they're constructed, even who constructed them. He would say such things as, a well digger when he was hired was expected, his progress was expected to be equal to his height. So that's between 5 and 6 foot a day. That's what he was expected to do. Now, I thought, well, you dig a hole in the ground until you got water. Well, it doesn't work that way. You dig down, and there's the rock or brick or whatever you're going to use to stein it. It's a term they use, is done from the top. You don't dig the hole and then start at the bottom and build things up. You go down the top. There's an interesting technique where they use what they call a curb. Okay, let's say you're going to have a 4-foot well. You take a 4-foot circle of solid board, cut a hole out of the center, lay that on the surface, and then the well digger starts digging the hole. When he gets the center hole, which is big enough to accommodate him, he starts undercutting. That curb starts to settle. You start putting your stone, that curb acts as the base, the support. And as soon as you have all that steined with stone, and stone or brick or whatever you're using, once you've completed that circle, it's pretty stable. You're not gonna, there's nothing stronger than a circle. And then you take the next one and you keep going down, down, down. Okay, you get down to a place that's called hard pan. And you have no water in this well yet. You get this hard pan. Hard pan is it's a gravelly sand strata that's extremely hard. They do all the work they're going to do in completing the interior of the well, and then they puncture this hard pan. The groundwater will start coming up. And it will come up until it reaches an equilibrium. So you could have a well that let's say a 30-foot well where you have to go down 10 feet for the water, or it could come up to just a couple feet from the surface. Or in the worst case scenario, it'll come up like a spring and then you've defeated your purpose of doing that. But think about that, the techniques that these people had figured out and how they did things. I mean, it's amazing. The more you get into what the craftsmen and the skilled people back in the 1800s could do, I mean, it's mind-boggling. We always think that they're primitive. They aren't primitive. Less until, no, they built things that we cannot duplicate today. When you look at some of the stonework, right? One of the things in historic archaeology that I enjoy, and I've done a lot of traveling abroad, in Europe particularly, and I can almost look at a field fence or a house structure, and I can pretty much guess the ethnicity of the builders. Right? The finest stonemasons, as far as I'm concerned, are the Italians. They do wondrous things with stone and marble particularly. For those familiar with the area with the Germans in Cedarburg, in that area there, did you ever look at the side of one of those buildings? I mean, you could put a straight edge on that either way, and it's perfect. The Irish, if you go in areas where the Irish settled, they didn't use much. Most of their stonework was what they call dry as opposed to wet. Wet means you use mortar. Theirs was dry. And so if you go to Ireland, you see these stone fences between the fields. These have been built up over centuries, but they're just piled up rocks. In a lot of other areas, England, for example, they would use a lot of mortar. And so when these immigrants came over and they were building their homesteads, their houses and their barns and whatever, they brought the same skills that were abroad at home and applied them here. If you're interested in given it when you're driving around, you drive around Wisconsin from the historical perspective. If you want to know what ethnic groups originally settled that area, look at road signs. You go through an area, you see a lot of Italian, or you see a lot of Irish, a lot of English. In this area here, you'll see a lot of Irish and English. English being not from England, but second generation immigrants from the East Coast. They came in here when the land was put up for sale by the U.S. government, and they made up a lot of your large land speculators. Pardon?
Norwegian.
And yeah, the Norwegians and Finnish, you'll find those more up north because they came in for the logging. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So anyway, that pretty much covers it. This report, I've talked to Adam, and I'd like to see if we can reproduce it. It's a good report. When we did this report, as I was telling Dr. Sigian there, the museum asked if we could write this report for the average reader. And if anybody who's a professional archaeologist or a professional anything will know it's very, very difficult not to put a lot of technical jargon that you and another archaeologist in this case would understand. You know, you might have a term or a phrase that has a very, very broad meaning, and so anyway, they didn't want that technical jargon. They wanted anybody to pick up this to be able to read it. Well, I had never written a report like that, and I was sort of taken aback. Well, I'll try, but you know, I've written a lot of but they're all technical reports. Technical reports that were even boring to me. You know, if I wrote them, I still found them boring. Anyway, we had two ladies. Amy Bly worked for Midwest Express. She was their PR person, and she was she had a trained journalist, and another lady, Brownie Lewis. They said, "Well, we'll help you out." So as I complete the sections, I would give them. Well, the first section I completed, I gave to these ladies to be edited. Well, it came back, and my gosh, I could hardly see where my text was. It was just, and I said, well, I flunked this course. But over time, we kind of got it together. It's a very, very readable book. But this, I was looking at here, this is the second printing. And so I've talked to Adam, and his sister is in computer design or something like that, graphic design. And we want to get some ideas on how we can reproduce this and maybe make it available here at the Indian Agency House. So the only other thing I can say is Archaeological Rescue kind of finished their last project was here at the old Indian Agency House. We put in, I believe, 11, 12 units, 2 by 2, scattered throughout. Constance Godfrey, a colonial dame, I think she was the director here at the time. This was in the early or late 80s and early 90s, when we'd come up here every weekend and we would work on our squares. Sometimes we'd have 20, 30 people working on in the field. And so we'd come up every Saturdays, and we did that for two summers in a row. Very, very enjoyable. The problem that you have on historic sites, as opposed to prehistoric sites. Prehistoric sites can sometimes be occupied over a vast period of time. And someone once told me that in this area, that you have a soil buildup of approximately 1 inch every 300 years. All right. So if you have a 3,000-year-old site, you're going to go down quite a ways before you bottom that site out. But 300 years for a site like this, it's all going to be compressed together. That's really where the problem in historic archaeology is. If you get one that had a single occupational episode and then they moved out, you're in good shape. This was built as an Indian agency, was a farmhouse, I think it was a tavern or something like that at one time. So there's a lot of activity that went on this property. And sometimes we were looking, just outside this front door, we put down a unit, not too deep, maybe 20 centimeters. We found wagon tracks. And I've also found a portion of a military gold epaulette that was there. We went up by the back door, by the well. We thought, well, that's going to be a task area for food preparation or whatever. We just kind of judiciously placed them around, and we ran into the problem. It was very, very difficult to discern any time period. It was all kind of mixed. So anyway, any questions? Probably talked long enough. Yes, ma'am.
The debate collection, is your book available anywhere now?
Now?
Yeah.
I believe this is the only copy.
That's the only copy.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why, in talking with Adam, we thought, well, you know, if we can find some way to economically reproduce this, we'll do it. And I know nothing, I'm not a techie, okay? That's why we turned to his sister, who was, or anybody that's got any, computer design, that type of background, to give us a hand on this. So.
I have another question. When you talked about you were working as an accountant,
Yes.
did you go back to school for anything with archaeology or history, or you just learned it on the fly as you got it?
No, when I was working for the accounting firm, I was back at UWM in their graduate program.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I was also working at MBA.
You graduated what?
Pardon?
And what is your degree then?
The Master of Science in Anthropology. So, yeah.
Just to comment on something you said, you mentioned Dubé, Portage trading post, or lived in the old trading post off to the side here, and he said that one of the character references in his trial was Moses Strawn. And just wanted to mention that Moses Strawn came to Wisconsin in 1835, which is about 2 years after the Kinsey's left the agency house here. He came in as a lead prospector, but some of his belongings date back to an earlier period from when he was living back east. So some of the furnishings in the house, some of the items in the collection here were owned by Moses Strawn. So his descendants helped furnish this house.
The reason I think we have the Dubé house site down here nailed is when we were working up there. There's been no testing back there. We just did surface collection, and we did find residential debris. So that's what we're pretty sure. And there's not a lot of, I think Waban mentions a trading post or something down there, okay, just north of the Indian Agency House. Well, if you walk down there, there's not a lot of area to deal with. There's only about, maybe 500 feet at the most. So, again, it'll be an interesting place. Does the Indian Agency, do you own that property there?
The city owns that.
Pardon?
The city owns that.
The city owns that, so we'd have to get their
That makes
permission
it public property.
to do something with that. Yes?
On the humorous note, do you own an Indiana Jones hat? Have you ever had an Indiana Jones movie or a moment? And what's your favorite archaeology movie?
When I was talking about putting this ad in the paper, getting 150 returns, if you will, it was during that era when Indiana Jones, the movie, I think Raiders of the Lost Ark, came out, which is my favorite. And yes, a lot of them thought that that's what we did. And I tried to explain, can you imagine going home to your wife and family and say, well, I've had a rough day as Indiana Jones? But no, I expected them to show up with leather jackets, fedora, all the other accoutrements, but yeah. What was the other part of that question?
Okay, it was, do you own an Indiana Jones hat? You know, the wide-brimmed hat? Okay.
I do. I just like fedoras, though.
Was there any Indiana Jones moments, during your digs at all? Did anything exciting happen?
Okay, yeah, I'll have to tell you this one. All right. Every archaeologist have their moments, and this was, I'm going to say, probably pretty embarrassing for me. We're looking for Old Fort Des Moines number 2, which was on the confluence of the Raccoon and Des Moines River in Des Moines, Iowa, downtown. All right. This area was, I think, a AAA baseball field or something. Okay. Well, the maps I had, and the maps were by Jefferson Davis. Yeah, he is responsible for a lot of the construction at Fort Winnebago, probably on this house, and also the forts. Okay. Anyway, our reference was the bank of, would be the north bank of the Raccoon River. And we had a complete map of the fort area, but we had no idea where to start, okay? I mean, you can move a transparency over the map and it's a hit or miss. Anyway, so I had this bright idea. We called in a big backhoe that was going to start at the bank of the Raccoon River and cut a trench all the way back until we could ascertain and correlate it to our old military map. Well, this property had been used as a dump from probably 1900 to maybe through the 1930s. It was filled with typical hotel debris, broken whiteware, yeah, just stuff you'd expect from commercial enterprises. And plus, probably a lot of their garbage. The stench was so bad that it made the newspapers in downtown Des Moines. And people wanted to know why that trench was opened. And pretty soon they were looking at me. Yeah, I guess so. The worst part of it, though, when you talk about the Indiana Jones movement, when we were digging, and at that time I think I was a lot younger and took more chances, but I would go down in the bucket of the backhoe, and I would kind of look at the stratigraphy. And the backhoe operator, an elderly gentleman and very experienced, assured me that if I stayed close to the inside edge of the bucket, that if there was a collapse, he could get me out. That was reassuring, right? Anyway, nothing happened until about a day later, and we were maybe 50 yards away from the trench. It did collapse, and it collapsed with this resounding thud. And I could just, my mind was saying, whew, could have been, That I think was probably the most dangerous, or at least an experience that could have been fatal, Other than that, no, I started to use common sense after that. I didn't do foolish things anymore. So, any other questions or comments?
Any Native American, have you dug up any Native American things where the tribes have to come and look at it at all?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to talk about the Convent Knoll site out in Elm Grove. Anybody aware of that situation? We got a call from Dr. Joan Freeman Clark that they're building a road for a proposed development. The property had been owned by our Sisters of Notre Dame since 1847. And this property behind their big convent and everything, it was in the front of the property, was really only used for, was cultivated. It was a very, very sandy soil. So what was found was a lot of red ochre, which is powdered hematite. And not only a little bit, but just it was in gobs, there's just layers of it. So we went out and we decided that it had to be completely excavated. We found a pit probably about 5 meters wide and maybe 2 meters deep that had 5 individuals in it. These 5 individuals were all males between the ages of probably 18, young adults, 18 maybe to 25. That was determined by sagittal crested, whatever, sagittal suture, I'm sorry. They had been murdered. When I say murdered, it was they had met a very violent end. Dr. Helen Young, who was at that time the Waukesha County coroner, was on the site. And we took, after we excavated the material, we took it to her lab, and she did the pathology on it. One individual had projectile point embedded in one of the vertebrae. And she was telling us, she says, this individual was killed by that projectile point, but it was a very slow, painful death, and explained how it had to pass through the kidney and the whole works. Okay, these individuals were literally packed in, and when they were buried, if they had a leg that didn't fit right, it would be broken and folded back in, and they're just all laying kind of helter-skelter in this thing. The other interesting thing about these individuals, they had been scalped. All right. When I say scalped, their hair had been removed. The striations on their hair all the way around was there. Now, I was always under the impression, like I think most people, that scalping was brought in by the British as a bounty, evidence of a kill, so you could get the bounty. Native Americans have always kind of denied that they did that. But we have, this was a archaic site, approximately 3,000 years old. We have evidence of scalping. So we continued to excavate, and we found an adult male who had been placed in the grave but had not suffered the same fate as and they were only about maybe 20 meters away. And just below that male, we found a child's burial. And this child, we think, was probably no more than 4 or 5 years old. It was also had been ceremoniously interred. We found a beautiful blade that had been a killed blade, you know that term. All right. When a blade has been killed, it's been purposely broken and then put together and laid in the gravesite. Right. Well, at that time, the American Indian movement was doing this big march to Washington, D.C. And this, as a result, this site gained national prominence, and it was, I think, on Good Morning America and a bunch of other things. All right. Well, we started to have political pressure on us to get out, finish up and get out. The developer, Grudemat out of Sheboygan, said, okay, we're politically, we're kind of on shaky ground here. Let's see if we close this up. So we decided we're going to remove this. We had excavated the 5 adults in the pit and a single adult individual. We hadn't totally excavated this infant burial. So what we did, the soil matrix was beautiful. It was all sand. We undercut and took 2 long 2x4s, that probably 8 foot, about 4 foot apart, dug and laid them along the burial. And but before we did that, we put like 1x6s, or and made a pallet is what we did, and we undercut that and slowly moved it under, and we slowly got it under. We covered it with newspaper, wet newspaper, and plaster of Paris. And the idea was that if we could lift this out, get in a truck, and get it to the lab, we would have some time to finish the detailed analysis and excavation on it. Well, what happened was there was a man, I can't recall his name, but he claimed to be a Canadian Cree Indian, and he took us to court, and we had a trial out at the Waukesha County Courthouse on the disposition of all this material we had excavated. The judge there was a reserve judge, well into his 80s, and the upshot of this trial was we lost all this material. It was taken away from us and taken up to the Lac du Flambeau Reservation and buried. And we even asked if we could have some time to do the analysis and then we gladly turn it over to the Indians. And it wasn't one of the tribal groups, the Chippewa. It was the urban Indians down in Milwaukee. So I had met this guy. We were leaving the courthouse, and we were in the elevator, and I says, "By the way, what do you do? You know, what do you do for a living?" And he looked at me and he says, "I'm an itinerant troublemaker." That was his reply. So okay, so he was going to move on to some other, issue, but we lost material. Then ultimately we learned that some pothounds had looted the site up in the reservation where they're buried, so the material was gone. The uniqueness about this site was the red ochre was centimeters thick. I mean, it was normally you see a sprinkling. This was just very, very thick, and the closest source I believe is Iron Ridge or about by Mayville, that area up there, where you find that powdered hematite in that concentration. That was, that was probably that was really exciting only because it'd make a good movie. Anything else? You're welcome.
Thank you. And next Tuesday, Dr. Azizian will be talking about prehistoric archaeology, so I hope you all make it out for that. This weekend and next weekend, we're doing here with Dr. Azizian and Mr. Wackman, and also some other archaeologists, a community archaeology day, where the community can get involved in learning the process firsthand of archaeology. So we're trying to learn more about the blacksmith shop that served the Ho-Chunk tribe at this agency. So I hope that if you're interested, come on out. So, but again, next Tuesday and the following Tuesday, we'll have our final two speakers of the series. Thank you to the museum at the Portage for co-sponsoring the series with us. Good evening. Good to see you next Tuesday.